They told you myth was fiction. They told you it was story. They told you it was made up. But what they never told you is that myth is a machine, a transmission device, a symbolic engine designed to activate memory, restructure perception, and unlock dormant codes in your field. They never told you that gods were never people, that monsters were never beasts, that journeys were never literal. Because if you knew how to read myth, you wouldn't need permission anymore. You wouldn't need systems. You wouldn't need doctrine. You would remember what you came here with. And that kind of memory is dangerous to a world built on forgetting. Myth was never for entertainment. It was encryption. The ancients weren't writing bedtime stories. They were encoding multidimensional technology in language. They were building soul maps out of symbols, planting vibrational blueprints into the collective field disguised as legend, so only those with inner eyes would see them. The flood wasn't water. It was frequency collapse. The serpent wasn't evil. It was Kundalini. The virgin birth wasn't a miracle. It was the awakening of inner polarity. Every name was a frequency. Every weapon was a thought form. Every place was a layer of consciousness. You were never meant to worship these stories. You were meant to remember that they were written about you. Because long before you had a name, long before you had a story, you were already moving through these archetypes. You've died and been reborn. You've descended and returned. You've stolen fire. You've been the exile. You've been the light. And every time you forget, the myth finds its way back to you. Through books, through dreams, through moments of rupture, through symbols you can't explain. Myth survives because it is seeded in structure, in geometry, in number, in pattern. That's why the same archetypes appear across oceans and continents: Isis and Mary, Prometheus and Lucifer, Quetzalcoatl and Thoth. Because the myth is not cultural, it's not local, it's structural. It's embedded in the way light organizes itself. It's coded into the shape of your DNA. It's mirrored in the stars. The 12 disciples are the 12 constellations. The resurrection after 3 days is the sun's path through the solstice. The tree of life is the nervous system. The serpent is the spine. You don't believe in these things. You live them, you embody them, you breathe them. The myth is you. But to remember that, you have to decondition the lens that taught you to see mythology as fable. You have to dismantle the part of your mind that demands literal meaning. Because myth never speaks in surface language. It speaks in layers, in symbols, in mirrors. It teaches not through answers, but through resonance, through repetition, through echoes. You hear the same story again and again, not because history repeats, but because consciousness moves in spirals. The same forces keep emerging in new masks: the tyrant, the trickster, the mother, the wanderer, the child, the destroyer, the redeemer. These are not characters, they are frequencies. When you align with them, you open doorways. When you resist them, they show up as challenge. That's why you attract the same lessons again and again. It's not because you're broken. It's because the myth in you is unfinished. The chapter wants to close. The field wants to evolve. But until you embody the archetype consciously, you live it unconsciously. That's what the ancients knew. That's why temples were built as symbolic maps. The body of the god was the structure of the building. You didn't enter a temple to pray. You entered it to walk the story. You passed through darkness, trial, temptation, silence, and light. You weren't told what it meant. You were made to experience it. And in doing so, the myth moved from information to activation. And that's what's happening now. The old myths are waking up, not in books, in you, in your dreams, in your breakdowns, in your synchronicities. They're not memories of the past. They're instructions for now. Templates, portals, initiations. The moment you stop reading mythology as fantasy and start treating it as encrypted architecture, everything shifts. The gods return. The images move. The symbols organize. You begin to see the code behind events. the mirror behind your pain, the map inside the spiral. And then you stop fearing the chaos, because you realize it's always been part of the pattern. Destruction always precedes rebirth, silence always precedes voice, darkness always precedes the flame. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what part of the myth is this? And that shift, from victim to reader, is the beginning of power. Real power. Not the kind you force, the kind that reorganizes the world around you because your field is aligned with structure again. That's why the myth survives, not because it entertains, but because it organizes. It synchronizes. It remembers. And now, so do you. You were never meant to understand the myth with the rational mind. It was never meant to be dissected, analyzed, debated. That's why it resists academic breakdown. Because myth doesn't enter through the intellect. It enters through the field, through the symbolic channel, through the body. You don't read a myth. It reads you. It filters your awareness through its structure. It finds the fracture lines in your psyche and pulls them forward so they can be transmuted. That's why real myth doesn't comfort. It breaks you. Then it shows you how to rebuild. It puts a sword in your hand and sends you into the forest with no map. It takes your name away. It strips you down to silence. Because only in the emptiness can you hear the real instruction. That's why heroes always lose something first. The parent dies. The village burns. The lover is taken. The job collapses. The identity shatters. Not as punishment, as entry point, as disruption of false structure, so that the deeper self can emerge. You think you're the one reading the story, but the story is reading you, tracking where you are in the spiral. Initiation doesn't wait for comfort, it waits for readiness. And readiness isn't perfection, it's surrender. It's when you stop pretending and start listening. That's when the myth opens. That's when the symbols start to appear in your dreams, in the sky, in the eyes of strangers. That's when the gods begin to whisper. Not because they're outside you, but because you've created the inner silence necessary to receive them. They were always speaking. You just forgot how to hear. Myth is the bridge back to that hearing. Because it is structured language, it bypasses your programming. It slips past your doubt. It speaks to the part of you that existed before your name, the part that remembers what the pine cone means, what the feather means, what the two snakes mean. These aren't decorations, they're codes. The pine cone is your pineal. The feather is Ma'at, balance. The twin serpents are Ida and Pingala, the polarity lines of your energetic spine. These images weren't randomly chosen by cultures. They appeared because the same forces were being felt in different ways by different people in different lands, all tuning into the same energetic architecture. The myth speaks through structure. The stories are different. The symbols are consistent. And once you see that, you begin to speak the ancient tongue again, not with words, with pattern recognition, with energetic literacy. You look at your own life and see the echo. You see which archetype is dominant, which one is in shadow, which one is demanding expression. You no longer suppress your rage. You study what myth it belongs to. Is it Kali? Is it Sekhmet? Is it Lilith? You no longer hide your grief. You name it. Is it Inanna's descent? Is it Isis searching for Osiris? Is it Demeter mourning Persephone? And in naming it, you're not romanticizing pain. You're initiating it. You're turning it into a rite. You're assigning it purpose, movement, shape. That's how myth alchemizes emotion. It gives it a container. Not to limit it, but to transform it. Uncontained pain repeats. Contained pain evolves. Myth is the vessel that lets the human experience become sacred again. And when you walk into that vessel, you don't escape the world. You begin to rewrite it. You were never meant to read myth passively. You were meant to wear it, breathe it, sweat it, move through it. The ancients didn't study mythology like scholars, they reenacted it with their bodies. They carved the myths into temple walls not as decoration but as living diagrams. Every gesture was a map, every corridor a phase of the soul. Every gate you passed through was a chakra, a vibrational threshold, a lesson in the movement of light. And this wasn't metaphor, it was biological programming. The priest didn't tell you what Osiris meant. He put you in the dark chamber. He sealed the door. You sat in silence for 3 days, entombed like the god. No food, no light, no distraction. Until the lower mind collapsed and the inner star was forced to rise. This was not education. This was metamorphosis. You died in there. Not physically, symbolically, mentally, energetically. You entered myth not to believe in gods, but to experience the shift in identity from ego to essence. That was the purpose of myth. Not to teach you who the gods were, but to show you who you are underneath the mask of personality. Every descent was a letting go. Every monster you faced was a locked part of your nervous system. Every sword you drew was a breath of activation. Every resurrection was a full-body alignment. The rites were not religious. They were neurological. They weren't about submission to some deity. They were about integration of frequency. The gods weren't above you. They were stages of you, archetypes, energy patterns, aspects of the one fractaling into multiplicity. And by embodying them, you didn't become spiritual. You became real. You became geometrically sound, vibrationally precise, magnetically aligned. That's what the initiations were for. To break distortion, to burn through noise, to raise your signal high enough that the deeper codes could begin transmitting again. And these initiations didn't require belief. They required willingness, stillness, presence, the courage to be dismantled, the humility to not understand, the discipline to endure the inner collapse long enough for a new self to emerge. That's why real initiates didn't chase powers. They chased structure. They weren't looking to escape the body. They were turning it into a temple. They weren't trying to get out of the world. They were learning to reprogram it from the inside. Because once the myth is activated in you, you don't need the story anymore. You become the symbol. You become the frequency. And then the world responds, not with applause, with alignment, with resistance that sharpens, with friction that sculpts, with mirrors that no longer lie. Because the moment you activate the archetype, the field reorganizes. Your life becomes initiation. Your work becomes ritual. Your silence becomes signal. You walk differently. You see differently. You speak differently. Not as performance, as transmission. That's what the ancients encoded. Not worship, but walk. Not prayer, but presence. Not obedience, but alignment. And you can activate this now. You don't need a temple. You don't need a priest. You don't need a desert or a robe. You need breath. You need space. You need the willingness to feel, to track the myth through your own experience, to ask, what phase am I in? What archetype is showing up? What symbol keeps repeating? What part of the story am I avoiding? And most of all, what part of me have I refused to initiate? Because the parts you don't initiate, life will. Through pain, through confusion, through repetition. Myth doesn't stop trying to reach you. It just gets louder. Until you answer. Until you turn toward the dragon and stop pretending it's someone else's fault. Until you walk into the cave and stop blaming the dark. Until you climb the tower and stop asking to be saved. That's the mirror myth holds. It won't move until you do. But the moment you move, fully, consciously, with reverence and precision, it bends. Not instantly, not softly, but unmistakably. The symbols begin appearing. The archetypes begin speaking. The right people, books, dreams, visions begin organizing themselves around your field. Not as random events, but as resonance. Because you're broadcasting something real now, something stable, something worthy of reflection. You're no longer leaking energy, you're directing it. That's the difference between seeker and initiate. The seeker collects stories, the initiate becomes one. And the moment you become the myth, the world starts reading you differently. The system starts responding. Not because it favors you, but because it recognizes structure. And structure is what reality obeys. These myths are not separate. They are not owned by cultures. They are not historical events. They are living programs embedded in the collective field of human consciousness, and they repeat not because we forget them, but because we haven't finished running their code. Every time a civilization is born, the myths come with it. Not as decorations, but as initiatory scripts. They follow you because they are you. You've burned with Prometheus, descended with Inanna, risen with Horus, suffered with Christ, tricked with Hermes, shattered with Dionysus. You don't need to believe in the myth, it believes in you. It activates when you hit the frequency of the archetype. You don't study it, you embody it. You don't worship it, you remember it. Take Prometheus. He didn't just steal fire from the gods, he brought forbidden knowledge to humans, not to help, to awaken. Fire is not warmth. Fire is consciousness. To give fire is to ignite awareness. And the punishment? Endless pain, daily looping, the liver devoured over and over again. This is not mythology. It's how it feels when your awareness expands faster than your world can hold it. When you awaken in a system still asleep. When your gift becomes your curse. If you've ever felt like your wisdom isolated you, like your insights made you unbearable to others, like your inner fire turned into a wound, then you're living the Promethean myth. Not metaphorically, literally, vibrationally, cell by cell. Or take Inanna, queen of heaven and earth. She descends into the underworld to confront her shadow. 7 gates. At each one she removes a layer, her crown, her jewels, her robe, her identity, until she stands naked before her dark mirror, her sister Ereshkigal. This is not just a story of ego death. This is the map of descending through your own trauma, your own energetic residue, your own denial of self. 7 gates, 7 chakras, 7 initiations. At each level you surrender, you release illusion, you drop what is not you. Until only truth remains, raw, primal, uncomfortable. That's the point. Inanna isn't destroyed, she returns, transformed, integrated, crowned again. Not with power, but with presence. This is how the feminine awakens, not through light, but through descent. And if you've ever lost everything only to find yourself, you've walked her path. Horus was not just a falcon-headed god. He was the child of divine polarity, Isis and Osiris, the third force born from death and wisdom. Horus doesn't just fight Set, he fights fragmentation. Set is the force of dismemberment, of chaos, of separation. Horus fights to restore the throne. The throne is not a seat, it's coherence, the rightful order of the self. And that's what the Eye of Horus symbolizes. The reintegration of vision, of wholeness, of restored perception after trauma. You don't believe in Horus. You become him every time you reclaim your energy from the pieces life shattered. Christ isn't a religion. It's a sequence, a vibration, a field of unconditional transmission. The myth encoded in his story. Birth in obscurity, activation at 33 vertebrae, death at the base of the skull, resurrection in light, is a blueprint of Kundalini, of inner solar ascension, of ego collapse and divine reemergence. The cross isn't just an execution device. It's a cosmic axis, a geometry. The horizontal is the world. The vertical is the spirit. Christ stands at the intersection where matter and spirit merge. And when you suffer in silence, when you carry the pain of others, when you dissolve the self to find something higher, you are not copying the story. You are living its algorithm. Dionysus, too, offers no comfort, torn apart by titans, scattered, reassembled, worshipped through ecstasy, madness, inversion. He is the force that destroys the lie of control. He breaks the ego not with silence but with intoxication, dance, surrender. He reminds you that the divine isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's wild, chaotic, liberating. If you've ever cracked open through beauty, art, sex, grief, laughter, breakdown, if you've ever felt truth explode through pleasure and pain at the same time, you've walked with Dionysus. And Maui, the Polynesian trickster demigod, steals time, pulls islands from the sea, binds the sun. Not to conquer, but to remind humanity that limitation is optional. He is not polite. He is not subtle. He breaks the rules so the system can be reset. You channel him every time you challenge authority, rewrite your own story, disrupt patterns that felt permanent. Every myth is alive. Every story is a mirror. Every god is an invitation, and none of them ask you to follow. They ask you to awaken. You've been taught to read words, but no one ever taught you to read structure. You know how to follow a plot, but do you know how to follow a vibration, a symbolic loop, a fractal? The myth is not read like a book. It's read like a dream, like a storm, like an echo. It doesn't say, "This is the meaning." It asks, "Do you recognize the shape?" Because myth doesn't teach through concept. It teaches through rhythm, pattern, geometry. That's why the same elements return over and over again. The descent, the fire, the gate, the 3 days silence, the sacrifice, the trickster, the exile, the serpent, the sun. These are not props. They are universal access points. Points in the circuit of transformation that repeat in different forms across cultures and lifetimes. And if you begin to see them in your own life, not as metaphors but as structures of experience, the mirror sharpens. You begin to realize that your relationships are myths in motion, that your crises are rituals of death, that your choices are gates, that the things you call problems are just archetypal activations waiting to complete themselves. But to see that, you have to switch lenses. You have to stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What structure is moving through me right now?" That's when the chaos becomes coherent. That's when the pattern reveals itself. Start with the simplest signs. What stories do you keep repeating? What type of people do you keep meeting? What symbols keep showing up in your dreams, in your content feed, in the lyrics you hear, in the books that find you? These aren't random. These are the glyphs of the myth trying to surface through your field. If the serpent keeps appearing, ask why. Is it about fear or about energy rising? If the ocean keeps calling, is it cleansing you or asking you to descend? If the broken tower keeps falling, what false structure are you still clinging to? This is how you read myth. You don't memorize gods and timelines. You see through form into code. You track the field. You watch your life like it's a living scroll unfolding scene by scene, and you ask not, "What do I want?" but "What part of the map am I on?" And when you do that, when you reframe your experience through the mythic structure, you change your posture. You stop collapsing in confusion. You stand up in awareness. You become a participant, a player, a conductor of resonance. You walk through the fire not hoping it ends, but knowing it's the only way through. You enter the cave not to prove anything, but because that's where the symbol is waiting. You lose things not with despair, but with clarity. This is the sacrifice. This is the cut. This is the mirror. And reality responds. Because the system is watching. It reflects back your lens. If you see your life as accident, it stays accidental. If you see your life as ritual, it reorganizes. The energy moves differently. People treat you differently. The field bends differently. Because you're no longer leaking power by naming yourself a victim. You're naming the archetype. And the archetype opens gates. That's why mythology was encoded. Not to explain, but to initiate. Not to describe, but to activate. And you activate myth not by reading it once, but by tracking it, feeling it, moving with it, by becoming the scribe of your own mythos and treating every pattern in your life like it means something. Because it does. They didn't need to burn the myths to erase their power. They only needed to change the way you read them, to flatten the symbol, to shrink the archetype, to take the multidimensional code and reduce it to a cartoon, a parable, a children's fable, a church-approved metaphor drained of its heat. And it worked. They took the serpent, the sacred force of energy, and turned it into evil. They took the goddess, the source of all birth and renewal, and turned her into a virgin or a whore. They took the trickster, the transformer of stuck systems, and turned him into a joke. They told you Osiris was just a corpse, that Inanna was just a cautionary tale, that the gods were jealous, flawed, violent. They made you forget that these were never people, never history. They were frequencies, keys, technologies of becoming. And without them, your soul has no map. Your life becomes random. Your suffering loses structure. You feel pain and don't know it's a gate. You feel lost and don't know it's a descent. You repeat patterns and think it's failure, when it's just the uninitiated phase of your own unfolding myth. That's what happens when you lose symbol. You become flat, disoriented, divided. The body becomes biology instead of a vessel. Language becomes noise instead of invocation. Dream becomes nonsense instead of navigation. And the world, once a mirror, becomes a screen. Empty, projected, programmed. You become programmable. Because when you no longer read the world mythically, you become susceptible to any narrative that offers meaning, even if it enslaves you. That's why the modern world mocks symbolism. Because symbolic perception is sovereignty. It makes you ungovernable. You stop reacting to politics. You start reading the structure. You stop being hypnotized by headlines. You start watching the archetype at play. You stop fearing collapse. You start recognizing the phoenix. And the system can't survive that. A mind that sees mythically cannot be controlled algorithmically. It becomes self-organizing. It remembers how to dream. And dreaming is dangerous to a world built on repetition. So they replaced myth with algorithm, symbol with brand, archetype with identity, soul with productivity, death with entertainment. And in that switch, something in the human field collapsed, not disappeared, just went quiet. And now it's waking up again. Because the myths are older than empire, older than algorithm. They live in your bones, your blood, your dreams. And the more you resist the programming, the louder they return. That's why you're here. Not because you're curious, because the myth inside you is stirring. Asking to be remembered, asking to be read again. Not through theory, but through vibration, through shape, through silence, through dream, through suffering, through timing, through initiation. The modern world calls that delusion. The old world called it remembering. You don't recover myth by memorizing old stories. You recover it by changing the way you look at your own life. You return to symbolic vision. That means you stop interpreting events at face value. You stop calling things good or bad. You stop reacting as if you're being punished. You start tracking resonance, structure, echo. You ask different questions. Not why is this happening? But what does this match? Not how do I fix this, but what is this mirroring? Because life is not random. It is recursive. It reflects what is unspoken. It mirrors what you've ignored. It repeats what hasn't been integrated. When you see a symbol in dream, you write it down. You don't rush to interpret. You sit with it. You hold it in your breath. You ask it to reveal its timing. When a pattern keeps showing up, in people, in numbers, in chance. You stop calling it coincidence. You name it a glyph. You follow it. You let it lead. When you feel lost, you don't reach for noise. You go silent. You go inward. You ask, which phase of the spiral am I in? Is this a descent, a dismemberment, an eclipse, a crossing, a return? When you treat your life as a myth, the field responds, not by giving you answers, by sharpening your attention. Your dreams become vivid. The right texts find you. The old stories come alive. You notice the shape of things. You remember the meaning of the circle, the serpent, the cave, the mountain, the rose, the sword, the gate. They stop being metaphors. They become movements, frequencies, emotional containers. And when you begin to live in symbolic awareness, you become magnetic, not in the way the world teaches you to attract, but in the ancient way. You become a resonant field. You emit clarity. People feel it. Events organize around it. Initiations accelerate. You stop needing plans. You start needing trust. The myth leads, and you let it. You let your breakdown be sacred. You let your solitude be the cave. You let the betrayal be the shattering of the false mask. You let the dream be a map. You let the death be a door. This is not spiritual escapism. This is spiritual architecture. You're not making things up. You're remembering the deeper code that was always moving under the surface. You're tuning into the layer of intelligence that sees time not as linear but as layered, that sees your life not as random events but as precision rituals. Every phase you go through is mythically valid. Every pain you feel is archetypally intelligible. Every longing you carry is narratively exact. You don't need new stories. You need to read your old ones differently. And from that moment on, nothing is wasted. Not the years you lost, not the relationships that broke, not the moments you fell apart. They all become part of the arc, part of the return, part of the song. This is the rebirth of symbolic sight. And once it turns back on, you never see the world the same way again. You were never meant to just understand the myth. You were meant to become its expression, not the character in the story, but the frequency the story was built to transmit. Because once the symbolic body inside you is reactivated, your entire system becomes mytho-sensitive. Your language changes, your posture changes, your timing becomes precise, your voice becomes a tuning device. You don't talk about gods. You carry them, not as belief, but as coherence. You are not a messenger, you are a mirror. And that's why the ancient teachers didn't lecture. They radiated, they didn't convince, they harmonized. You walked into their presence and your field remembered. You felt something ancient open, not because they gave you answers, but because their myth was alive. And that is what you are becoming. Not someone who recites symbolism, but someone who is the symbol. Not someone who quotes myth, but someone whose nervous system emits a structure that others feel as pattern, clarity, silence, resonance. The new mythology is not being written on paper. It's being encoded in bodies, in the way you walk into a room, in the way you hold your grief like a ritual, in the way you make decisions that contradict the collective programming but align with a deeper arc. You are no longer playing a role. You are functioning as an archetypal node. Your choices don't just affect your life, they shift resonance in the collective. Because once the myth is awake in you, it becomes contagious. Others feel it. They don't know why. They just start remembering too. Their dreams change. Their questions sharpen. Their suffering starts to make sense. Not because you told them what to believe, but because your field made them feel seen by something older than language. This is what the ancient initiates meant when they said the gods walk among us, not as statues, not as visions, but as humans who have aligned so deeply with the story of becoming that their very existence becomes mythogenic, a source point for meaning, reflection, order. And this is not ego. This is not performance. This is what happens when your life stops being about you and starts becoming a vehicle for signal. You don't disappear. You deepen. You stop asking what's next. You start asking what wants to come through. You don't force outcomes. You follow structure. You become precise, not rigid, not frozen, alive, but harmonized. Tied not to personality, but to current. This is what it means to embody myth. You listen differently. You choose differently. You feel reality like a score, and you move inside it like a musician inside music. And your presence speaks more than your words. Because myth never ends on the page. It ends in behavior, in breath, in the tone of your silence. And when you reach that place, where the myth is no longer something you study but something that breathes through you, you are no longer a student. You are a signal, and reality begins to arrange itself around that signal in ways no logic can track. But every symbol will confirm. When the myth activates in you, reality begins to whisper back. Not with language, but with reflection. The deeper you move into alignment with your symbolic path, the more the field organizes itself around you in synchronicity. This is not magic. This is resonance. You don't manifest it. You match it. You don't control it. You become coherent with it. That's when the signs increase. That's when the timing sharpens. That's when the same number appears 3 times in a day. The same animal crosses your path twice in a week. A stranger says a sentence that answers your inner question. A book falls from a shelf and opens to the exact page your soul needed. You didn't cause it. You entered the structure that allows it. You're not being favored, you're being mirrored. Because when the inner world stabilizes, the outer world becomes readable. The code appears in plain sight. The message is always there. But until you align, you can't receive it. You dismiss it as chance. Coincidence. But now you see it differently. You see the frequency behind the form. You understand that life is myth in motion, constantly reflecting your alignment, constantly shaping itself according to what you're embodying. The more you stabilize in archetype, the more real the reflection becomes. The myth begins to speak not through memory but through environment. The archetypes are no longer historical. They are alive, and the world becomes their stage. You're in the center of that stage, not as a performer but as a transmitter. Every interaction becomes a reading. Every situation becomes a glyph. Every disruption becomes a puzzle piece, and it's not about interpreting everything literally. It's about feeling the field, recognizing when a moment carries symbolic charge. When an event is not just an event but a portal, a transition, a message. Synchronicity is the language of the mythic current, the signature of alignment. It's how the world confirms that you're on the edge of something real, that you've passed a gate, that the spiral is turning. But you have to listen. You have to stay receptive. You can't force it. You can't chase it. It doesn't respond to need. It responds to stillness, to clarity, to internal honesty. The signs increase when you stop asking for proof and start living as if the myth is true. Because it is. Your name might not be Osiris or Artemis, your costume might be modern, your temple might be a city street. But the structure is the same, the initiation is real, and the signs are the confirmation. You are not imagining it, you are decoding it. The field is alive, the symbols are alive, and when your life becomes coherent with the pattern, reality sings back. That's the moment you realize you're not moving through chaos. You're moving through a chorus of precision, a grid of intelligence, a living mirror, and the more honest you become with yourself, the louder it sings. The myth doesn't end when you realize its meaning. It ends when you live it to completion, and completion doesn't look like escape. It looks like return. Every mythic cycle, no matter how grand, ends with the hero coming home. not to where they started, but to a world that now reflects who they've become. Because the true final initiation is not slaying the dragon, it's living in peace after the dragon. It's holding clarity in the marketplace. It's bringing the light back to the village. The treasure means nothing if it stays in the cave. The flame is useless if you never walk it back into the dark. And that's what most seekers forget. They awaken, but they don't return. They see the code, but they won't speak it in the human world. They feel the symbol, but they hoard it like a secret. But myth isn't here to make you special. It's here to make you functional, useful, humble, radiant. Myth gives you power only so you can carry presence into places that forgot themselves. That's why Moses came back from the mountain, why Buddha returned from the forest, why Christ reappeared after death, why Inanna rose and took Ereshkigal's pain with her. The end of the myth is not personal victory. It's reintegration. You're not done when you realize who you are. You're done when your presence transmits it, when your family feels it, when your community softens, when the world bends just slightly around your new stillness. That's the final gate, when your myth becomes invisible again, not because it's gone, but because it's become natural, embodied, lived. You no longer need the story, you are the signal, and the world mirrors it back not through applause, but through rhythm. The chaos dissolves, the repetition ends, the crisis doesn't come back. Because you answered the pattern, you completed the spiral, and that's when the new one opens. Not as a test, but as a transmission, a gift. Because once you've completed one myth, the field trusts you with another, a deeper one, a more collective one. You move from personal story into planetary function. You stop navigating your own shadows and start holding the light for others to face theirs. Not with advice, with coherence, with gravity, with mythic memory active in your bones. And that's how the lineage continues. Not through books, through breath, through presence, through choices made from clarity, through eyes that recognize the gods moving through strangers, through hands that remember how to build sacred structure even in modern soil. You become the elder, the map, the temple, not by trying, by finishing. By completing the inner myth so fully that your very existence restores memory. You don't have to preach, you just have to be real. The myth completes when you become unshakable, not in knowledge, but in frequency. And in that stillness, the next one begins. You don't carry myth because it's beautiful. You carry it because it's true. Because it remembers what the mind forgets. Because it speaks in silence when words fail. Because it orders the chaos when logic breaks. Because it keeps burning when your will collapses. And when you finally stop chasing answers and start living as structure, something ancient unlocks. You stop needing meaning to be handed to you. You start emitting it. You stop fearing the dark. You start walking it with rhythm. You stop asking when the spiral will end. You start recognizing the spiral as the path itself. And the moment you stop reading the myth and start breathing it, the system bends. Your life stops being something to survive. It becomes something to sculpt. You become the ritual, the presence, the glyph. The myth walks again. Not in text, not in temple, not in symbol, but in you. In the way you show up when no one sees you. In the way you stay when others flee. In the way you hold resonance while the structure breaks. In the way your silence becomes initiation for those not ready to hear, but ready to feel. You are not here to retell the old stories. You are here to remind the world that myth was never old. It is the breath beneath time, the pattern beneath pain, the grid beneath vision. And once remembered, it cannot be unspoken. You carry it not as belief, but as field, as orientation, as law. So when they ask you what you believe in, say, I believe in myth as code, in archetype as mirror, in suffering as alchemy, in silence as initiation, in symbols as sentences the soul can read. I believe in the gods returning through breath, through bone, through choice. I believe in a world rebuilt from memories, not as nostalgia but as structure. I believe we are not broken, only forgetful. I believe myth is how we remember, and I remember, now. And if this myth remembered something in you, let it speak. Write the phrase, "I remember," in the comments below. Not for me, for you. So the signal echoes forward. So others who carry the same memory know they're not alone. If the code moved you, hold it. Like this video not to support the channel, but to confirm resonance. Subscribe not to follow, but to stay connected to the field that's remembering itself through us. We're not here to build an audience. We're here to rebuild the myth, together, one memory at a time.